It's good to come and speak to you all today. I'll just talk very briefly. I won't go into necessarily a lot of the specifics about the elections next year, because I think a lot of the other speakers will probably know a bit more about them than I do. But I'll talk more about the general size of the challenge that Labour faces, the difficulties they currently face in the polling, and some initial ideas about how I think the Labour Party can climb out of the hole it's currently in. Having said that, if anyone is feeling sort of particularly sort of masochistic at any point, do go and look at the opinion polling in Scotland, because it is utterly dreadful. The fact that Labour has continued to go backwards after the disappointing results that they've had in recent years, I think is something that the party really does need to be concerned about. Our most recent poll, which was taken towards the start of this crisis, would have had Labour down to just 13 seats in the Scottish Parliament elections next year, so losing 10 of the 23 seats they currently hold off of the disappointing 2016 result. So yes, I mean, we've heard as well as Scotland the well-rehearsed arguments now about the kind of swings Labour needs to win the next election, the kind of seats they need to gain, the kind of places that they need to gain those seats. And I sort of understand why all of it sounds daunting, particularly in places like Scotland. Beyond that, though, I think it's also worth talking about the damage that has been done, not just to the polling numbers, but also to Labour Party's brand. If you think about how Labour was viewed in 2010 to 2015 under Ed, which is a comparison lots of people make at the to the current times, you can kind of sum up the Labour Party's image as being like the scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz, all heart and no brain. And ultimately then in 2015, voters ended up voting with their heads, and that wasn't for the Labour Party. But the Labour Party that Cllr has taken over is still viewed as having the scarecrow's head, but is now also viewed as having the Tin Man's heart. Just 28% of the public view the party as tolerant. More people see the Conservative Party as the tolerant party than the Labour Party. Just 17% view the Labour Party as in touch. Inside the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In the 9 metrics we tested, the Labour Party only beat the Conservatives on one metric. That was caring about the concerns of ordinary people. Although I think it begs the question, what's the point in caring about the concerns of ordinary people if you're out of touch with what those concerns are? The first big challenge for the leadership is basically to rebuild that trust in the Labour Party that has disappeared over the last half decade. And I think that that's going to involve lots of listening to people's concerns and actually talking about the issues that most people in the public care about, rather than issues which they don't care about, which I think has formed a lot of the things that the Labour Party has been discussing over the past few years, and one of the reasons why they've really struggled and why their brand has been particularly damaged. I think the second challenge is around competence. Now, I think this is one of the key areas where Cllr can really turn the Labour parties around, because under Ed, if you think they were seen as incompetent but quite nice, he has to solve the nicest, but I think Cllr can stand a really good chance of sort of taking the mantle of competency from the Conservatives. There are basically a bunch of Tory voters who feel uncomfortable about the current government, sort of competency Conservatives. They usually vote Conservative, but they actually don't necessarily think this government is particularly good at running things. And that's the most important thing that drives how they vote. Now, they haven't had any alternative for who else to vote for in recent years, because the Labour Party has been viewed as even more incompetent. If Cllr can turn that around, he can start dragging many of those Conservative voters over. And that's a big chunk of voters to bring into the fold and to give Labour a fighting chance at the next election, playing into his strengths, playing against the weaknesses of the current Conservative government. And I think the second thing that Labour needs to do is to find a sense of purpose. Basically, the people who win elections are the people who define the biggest problem that the country is facing and why they are best able to solve it, and rooting that solution inside the values of political parties. We can think of countless examples on the Labour side, whether that's coming out of the war and winning the peace after 1945 by the Labour Party saying it's going to build the welfare state. In 1997, the third way, we're going to save public services whilst not returning to old school socialism. but also on the Conservative side as well. 2019 was quite obviously just get Brexit done. 2015 was long-term economic plan. Labour needs to summarise its sense of purpose, because the Conservatives, now they've got Brexit done, it isn't clear what theirs is going to be either. You can think of some ideas. I'm sure we'll have lots of discussions over the next few years about what that sense of purpose is going to be. It's particularly tricky to tell right now, because part of it's going to be based on the way the Conservatives cock up. But you can see ideas, for example, making sure that Britain's better prepared to face a crisis in the future against a backdrop of Tory cuts. I think it can involve the environment as a factor. What we've seen in the polling is that environment and climate change is increasingly one of the top issues facing the country. And while everything else has dropped off the agenda in the minds of the public, lots of them still care about the environment during this crisis. And of course, there's the potential to have a narrative around rebuilding a better, fairer country coming out of coronavirus. We've already heard some sort of messaging from the Labour Party about looking after those people that have looked after us. I think that could be particularly persuasive, but having this sense of purpose that chimes with the public. And I'll finish off quite quickly just on a note of optimism, because while the size of the challenge is quite daunting, there's also some data from the polling to indicate why actually not all hope is lost in terms of gaining voters back in the next election. The government's numbers also aren't particularly good. We talk about how bad Labour's numbers are, but before this crisis started, and increasingly as this crisis goes on, the public don't have a particularly good view of the people at the top of the Conservative Party or the Conservative Party itself. That opens up an opportunity. And secondly, the electorate is more volatile than it's ever been before. So while it's a big number of voters you need to win over, more and more voters are moving between political parties than they would have done 20 or 30 years ago. So that means that you can see, or you're more likely to see, the kind of dramatic swings that Labour needs in order to get a majority at the next election. So big task ahead, big challenges, some thoughts there on the kind of things that Labour needs to do, but also a thought that it isn't necessarily impossible.
Thanks, Chris. That was really comprehensive. Since you started off with talking about Scotland, I think we should probably go to Jackie next to talk about the scale of the challenge we face there.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Can I just point out to everybody that I start life with dark hair. If in a year's time I end up having white hair, you understand the scale of the challenge that we face. And I caught the closing comments from Glenn, and you know, he is not kidding about the state of the challenge we face in Scotland. Let me just remind those that need reminding. At the most recent general election, we lost 6 out of the 7 seats we gained in 2017, but perhaps more significantly, we hemorrhaged 250,000 votes. So Labour in Scotland now commands 500,000 votes out of a population of more than 5 million, which has really changed days from where we used to be. A poll a couple of weekends ago that I keep reminding my colleagues of had us on 12% in the Scottish Parliament elections. Now that, you need to go back to 1910 to record a worst result in Labour's history in Scotland. So the overall trend is one of decline. But we all know there is no general election victory that delivers a majority at Westminster without ensuring we have seats in Scotland, seats in Wales, and seats in all parts of England as well. So we need to focus very much on being a party for the whole country. Now, having painted a bleak picture, I do want to be cautiously optimistic, and for 2 principal reasons. Firstly, I have no doubt the election of Keir Starmer has put a spring in people's steps. You know, and as one journalist said to me, my goodness, isn't it great to have the grown-ups back in charge? And I echo that, you know, completely. The question is, you know, what we now do to capitalise on that. And certainly his early numbers in Scotland, never mind the rest of the UK, are pretty promising. We're not used to that. Secondly, I think coronavirus has changed everything. You know, it's changed us socially, it's changed the economy, and in Scotland, it's changed public perception of independence. And let me explain why I think that. Because I do think there is a new political currency around, and the question is, can we capitalise on it as Labour? Because instead of identity, which has so infused every dimension of Scottish politics so far, I think we're going to see a shift to the language of ideas. You know, the obsession that we've seen with flags, with borders, with national identity has really taken second place to consensus and cooperation with the UK government. Who would have ever thought we would see that from the SNP? But it is true that coronavirus is no respecter of international borders, and frankly, it doesn't care about Scottish exceptionalism. So every day on our televisions, we see families who, are grieving, suffering loss. We grieve with them. It doesn't matter where they live. We see health service workers, social care workers, very much on the front line of this pandemic. We don't distinguish between whether they live in Scotland or England. And I think the Scottish Labour Party have a unique opportunity. We need to settle our position on the Constitution so we don't have the flip-flops that we had over recent years. And then we need to focus on the politics of ideas, not identity. That's the space we need to occupy in terms of our politics. And we will need to have some really good ideas across the country because our social care system is broken, the economy is frankly on life support, and there is a whole generation of young people who have given up hope. They don't think they're going to get opportunities going into the future. So we can't wait, and I've said this to colleagues many times, we can't wait for the inevitable public inquiry. It will take too long. We can't wait, much as we might enjoy watching it, seeing the SNP and their warring factions of Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon tear themselves apart. Until there is a vaccine, we know these restrictions will remain, and we need to step into that space to offer a different kind of politics. So for me, it's about hope, a vision for the future, a society and an economy that is fair and inclusive, but especially for younger people, one that offers them opportunity. Now, our pitch needs to be very clear, but we need to be ahead of the curve in making those arguments, and currently we're just not there. Right? Practically, I don't know what's going on in Wales, but in Scotland there is a lot of speculation that we shouldn't have the election in 2021, that it should happen in 2022. Of course we would say that. It suits us to say that. It doesn't suit the SNP. So we need to plan as if it's going to happen in 2021. With restrictions still in place, this will change the character of the election completely. Our campaigning needs to change. The door knocking that I so love is out the window. Dialogue, which hasn't really worked terribly effectively so far, needs to be improved and needs to be a key campaigning tool for us, because those telephone conversations are the stuff of the elections of the future. And we need to invest heavily in social media. I have never seen such activity on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, goodness me, politicians on TikTok as well. We need to use all these new media to get our message across. And that's not just about advertising, that's about creating networks of influencers in local communities, amongst family and friends on Facebook, etc. That is our new battleground, and I don't think we have the infrastructure to deal with it. The Democrats are doing some really interesting stuff in the States. We need to look at what they're doing and try and capture some of that for us. The other question that people are debating, is it a full postal ballot? Is it going to be a blended hybrid model? Nobody really knows. But the one thing I would say is it looks like Trump is having a full postal ballot in November. It looks like, as with most American elections, there's likely to be a poor turnout. There's likely to be allegations of vote rigging. We need to keep a very careful eye on that and be ready to decide what we do on the back of that. And in Scotland, frankly, we don't have all our candidates in place. We have never had a decent list strategy. So the NEC passing a paper on doing Zoom selections is fantastic news. We need to make progress with that. You'll forgive me, there's not long to go. There's a real sense of urgency. We need to decide what we're doing. We need resources to do it, which I will assume will be echoed everywhere, and we need to get on with it. We have a huge mountain to climb, and whilst I am always optimistic for the Scottish Parliament elections in 2021, I'm also conscious this is rebuilding so that we win a general election in the future. So I'll stop there, Nathan. Thank you very much.
That was excellent, Jackie. So if we can move across to another of our country's devolved parliaments, and we'll see if we can get Mary to talk about the very different but very real challenge we face in the Welsh Parliament now elections coming up next year as well. Mary?
Thanks, Nathan. Hello from the land of a Labour government, which brings its own challenges as well as its own advantages. And again, just to give a bit of perspective, we've had 5 Assembly elections since the Assembly was created in 1999. We've been the largest party in every one. We've come out in government afterwards in every one, either in coalition with support or in 2 of those 5. We actually won 30 of the 60 seats and were able to just about govern by ourselves. The lowest number of seats we've ever won was the 26 seats in 2007. But just because we do have a Labour government, we shouldn't assume that nothing is going to change. We've had 3 polls this year. As I said, the lowest that we've ever got in an Assembly election is 26 seats. Those polls had us on 24, 21 and 23. Now, the last poll was taken at the beginning of April, so just in the middle of which Cllr was announced as the new UK leader, and also much earlier in the coronavirus crisis. So I don't think we should assume it's going to be that bad, but I don't think we can afford to ignore them either, partly because we need to keep a progressive government that isn't either nationalist or conservative in Wales, but also because we know that Wales needs to make a massive contribution to a UK majority at the next general election for Labour as well. We've got a big challenge, but it does give us opportunities. We lost 6 seats in December to the Conservatives. One of those is Bridgend, where Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister, is standing down in the Assembly elections. And the other 5 were all in North Wales. We went into December's election with 6 seats in North Wales. We came out with 1, and we held that 1 with a majority of 213. So we have new Tory MPs across North Wales who are going to be very, very keen to see themselves continued by Assembly members as well. But one of the things that we always see in Assembly elections, or Senedd elections as they will be this time because of the renaming of the Welsh Parliament, is that actually while Plaid find it easier to get their vote out, some people will vote Plaid in an Assembly election but will vote Labour in a general election. Actually, the Tories have always struggled, even more than us, to get their vote out in the Assembly elections as well. And how all that's going to play out next year, assuming it's next year. I was interested in what Jackie said, actually, because we haven't had much debate about that in Wales. Our health minister made a sort of off-the-cuff comment that implied that, it wasn't 100% certain they'd take place, and the media got a bit excited. But there hasn't been much more discussion than that about postponement. I think we've seen Welsh Labour still has I was going back to what Chris said at the beginning, I think Welsh Labour still has a stronger brand. And I've got a quote from Roger Scully, who's one of the sort of key Welsh election analysts, from his book after the 2017 campaign, which said, Labour's successful 2017 campaign in Wales focused almost exclusively on the Welsh Labour brand. Jeremy Corbyn was largely excluded in favour of Carwyn Jones. Now, that worked in 2017. We weren't able to pull the same trick in 2019, where, I know as a candidate, the leadership was the biggest issue that came up on the doorstep. And by that, I mean the UK leadership. But I think that does give us something to build on in terms of brand. I think in terms of dealing with the crisis, we've had a much clearer strategy in terms of lockdown, stay home, stay local, no question of schools reopening. Recent public engagement survey by Public Health Wales indicated that 73% of the public supported our strategy there. So that's obviously hopeful, but I think we also have to recognise that we're in government, and no one who's been in government in the UK is going to come out of this entirely smelling of roses. There are significant issues in terms of testing, in terms of issues around care homes, that the Welsh Labour government is going to have to be held to account for as well. And that is going to be a challenge. One of the other challenges we face is, unlike Scotland, we don't have a clear Welsh media. We have what calls itself a national newspaper in South Wales, which no one reads in the north, and we have a daily newspaper in the north that no one reads in the south. And as someone who lives sort of in the middle of the North Wales coast, I'm perpetually daily frustrated by the inability to tune all my TV channels in to get Welsh news, and my family are fed up with hearing me swearing in the kitchen about the television tuning back to the northwest of England. But that is a serious issue in terms of kind of understanding communication, particularly as we get hit by the inability to do the normal sort of frontline doorstep campaigning. And I also wanted to echo what Jackie said about Facebook as well. Having been a parliamentary candidate in 2015, where I just put together postcodes, put together adverts and did sort of local advertising on Facebook, then being thrown in, being selected as a candidate as the general election was called in November, trying to do Facebook advertising is a whole completely different ball game. And I think, you know, it's almost impossible to do it without professional support now because of some of the, you know, quite reasonable sort of restrictions that they've put in place. But we need an infrastructure as a party that enables us to do that. But we've also got to look at, we know there are lots of local community groups on Facebook. People are getting their news from there, getting their information from there. Even if those people aren't part of those groups, they're getting it passed on from other people. And that's how we're going to have to increasingly communicate. And I think, you know, we all know that the world is changing. We don't know quite how we're going to come out of this, but clearly there are more people who are firstly online, secondly using online communication means more, and thirdly that all has a multiplier effect in terms of who they're talking to as well. So I think, you know, one of the biggest infrastructure things we need as a party is to put our Facebook advertising, local groups, etc. strategy into place and enable our candidates to use that. So I suppose to sum up, I'd, you know, really caution against assuming that because Wales has been Labour for 21 years, it will continue to be. As I say, the most recent poll at the beginning of April had us on 23 seats and the Tories on 26. I mean, the Tories have not won an election in Wales since universal suffrage. And I think we'll do everything we can to ensure that they can't do so this time. But we also shouldn't underestimate the amount of sort of, you know, resources within Welsh Labour that are being put currently into the coronavirus crisis because we're in government and because we have to do that. We can't just ask questions from the sidelines and plan an election campaign. And I think there is going to be a serious resource issue there. I think there's also going to be a serious resource issue because so many of the seats that are being targeted are in one area of 5 seats in North East Wales. And just in terms of, you know, where there's a bigger population in the south, so it's not going to be easy, even if we were able to do sort of local campaigning to get people to do that. So I really think we can't take Wales for granted, but from both the perspective of having a Labour government here for the people of Wales to keep us, you know, to keep us protected to a certain extent with a dented shield from the Tories in Westminster for the next 4 years, but also from the point of view of UK Labour, we absolutely have to hang on to government in Wales next year, and we have to do everything we can to ensure that's what happens.
Thank you, Mary. That was a really good summary of what's going on in Wales. Before I get to our last panelist, just a reminder, if you've got any questions, you can put them in the chat, which you should be able to find by hovering at the bottom of your screen and clicking on the chat button. So last but not least is the only politician on the panel who is in government, Tudor Evans, hopefully giving us an overview of some of the challenges we'll be facing, particularly in England, in local council elections next year now that we're going to have a double set of elections. So Tudor, you there?
Am I unmuted now?
Yep, there we go.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Afternoon, everyone. Yes, Britain's most southerly Labour council, Plymouth. So we've been all over the UK today, and my authority provided, I think, the only photo opportunity for Jeremy Corbyn in the 2018 elections, where he came to Plymouth's iconic Hoe to meet a gang of us just about half an hour after we finished the count. I think I can still about remember it, but I was very tired at the time. We've got local elections. And local elections, by which I mean council elections, are the bedrock of party organisation, party strength, party activism. So just for everything else we're trying to do, we need to firm up and strengthen our local government base. Why is that? Councillors are probably the most active of the activists. And the more of them we have, the more seats, parliamentary seats we can win, the more combined authorities, metro mayor seats we can win, the more, hopefully, parliamentary, Scottish parliamentary, Welsh parliamentary, and eventually Westminster parliamentary elections we can win. So we in Plymouth, our success has been rooted on playing it local, ultra local. We didn't have Jeremy's face on any of our leaflets. Mind you, we didn't have Ed's face, Gordon's face, Tony's face. We basically, you know, played it as an ultra local, very chauvinistic campaign, and we always have. We had adopted a strapline for our campaign this year before they were postponed, calling ourselves Sensible Local Labour. And at that point, we were trying to basically reinforce this idea that that all over the country, Labour councils run some very vital services in a very measured way. My council, my little council down here in the southwest, has £500 million to spend every year, which is serious money in the local economy, providing serious services like adult social care, children's safeguarding, economic development, cultural services, the environment and transport. For example, they are the bedrock in communities. They are the services that people rely on. They're the ones they see. And so it's very important, if we're going to have a strategy based on government competence, that we use this opportunity, in my view, to build back in the public mind what it is councils do, so that people can understand that when things go right in their communities, 9 times out of 10, it's nothing to do with the government, it's to do with local government. And so it's very important that our strategy has a very proactive and positive campaign to make the case for local government, because there is much to be excited about in Labour local government. We, in the LGA, a few months ago, published a volume called 100 Innovations by Labour in Local Government. If none of you have read it, I really do recommend it. It just shows some of the brilliant innovations that we do on a daily basis right across the country, and we can all play a part in associating ourselves with these local successes. I myself have shamelessly robbed a number of ideas from this book and sold it to my local electors. I recommend you have a good hard look at that. But we're in a different place, aren't we, from where we thought we would be when we were going out to bat in February and March for this year's elections. You know, we were talking about productivity deals, we're doing more for less, and all these strange old phrases which are no longer really required. I mean, I have started a economic resetting plan for Plymouth, which doesn't talk about recovery at all, because we won't be recovering into going back to where we were. We'll be resetting. But what that does do is to give us an opportunity to reset our economy in our own image for our own priorities. So, for example, minority sports like economic inclusion, fairness, equalities, and fairer distribution can actually be part of your reset, because there will be a need for you to do that proactively. It is our communities, our supporters, the poorest in society, they're going to suffer most from this virus and the post-virus environment. So we can be absolutely shameless in making that case, a case that we might have in the past have had problems in articulating fully. The core environmental proofing of those economic policies is unassailable now. As somebody just mentioned earlier on, climate change is still with us. It's going to be with us longer than the virus. Climate change policies, which local government had started to implement with a great deal of enthusiasm, will now become, in my view, a really important cornerstone as we build the economy back. We will need to build it in an environmentally sustainable way, and it gives us plenty of excuses to do some of the more challenging and difficult stuff. It's been very good for local government, actually. It's enabled us to move things for enormous pace. The officers presented to me a strategy for doing remote meetings and getting more and more of our councillors and staff online. And the plan was to implement, and yesterday held our first ever annual general meeting online and invested the Lord Mayor with full ceremonial honours. So local government can move quickly, can stay relevant, can lead change. And that's why we need progressive Labour local government to deliver that progress. I spend a lot of time online with meetings with local councillors, leaders from all over the country. And I'm not being chauvinistic when I say that by far the vast majority of the progress that is being made by Labour local government. And so it is absolutely fundamental as exemplars of what Labour can do with power, that we have more local government controlled by Labour. And that's why we need to get out there. We need to get out there and campaign like we've never done before. And the more seats we can take in local councils this year, the better for us in terms of taking charge of the local government association. We went backwards last year again because we lost so many good, great councillors. And the chance for us to rise again has got to be taken. I would also like to make just a couple of points about resources. I think we have a pretty damn good social media operation. I've made it my business to make sure that the people who are appointed in Plymouth to do social media know what they're doing, rather than people having a go. That's paid enormous dividend. Our targeting strategy, even when we have to navigate the hurdles of the restrictions on promote that the party central office put in place, we've managed to do a damn good job. We're making sure that all councillors have got web pages or got Facebook pages with up-to-date information, videos of their activity and so on. And it's a way in which we can cover and show that we're still busy even when we can't go out and knock on doors. I've got to say one plea now, please. If anybody's got any influence at all over this community organising, we had a community organiser for Devon and Cornwall who I haven't met in 2 years, and I'm the leader of the only Labour leader in the two counties, sorry, apart from Exeter's district council, the only Labour leader, and I hadn't met them in 2 years. They didn't even show up last polling day in Plymouth. So, you know, I probably trashed somebody's reputation there, so forgive me, but what I am saying is I'm not convinced that the way back is by harnessing church hall organisations into political fighting forces. What we need on the ground is political organisation. So we need more regional and local organisers paid for by the party, rather than building some movement that has seen us basically torch a lot of members' membership fees in the last couple of years. Last but not least, universal postal voting. I think this is our opportunity to go for it. I think it is absolutely essential that we cannot risk people not going to the polling station because they're afraid of catching the virus. And I think those decisions around universal postal voting will have to be made before Christmas. So I think we should be campaigning hard on that. Anyway, I think I've said enough. I hope I didn't bore you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tudor. That was really helpful to have the insights of someone defending his own Labour administration in this unprecedented time. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We've got about 20 minutes before we're yanked back to the main plenary. So to kick things off, we've got a question from Michael, which reads, isn't this pandemic going to change the social and economic situation in Britain, so that right now Labour needs to avoid commenting too soon on new policy commitments, and isn't staying flexible and nimble the right thing to do right now, so that we can focus on providing a critique of the SNP and the Tories? So if we could start with Jackie, I think. I've got you unmuted. There we go.
Yep, there we go. I actually disagree that we should say nothing just now. And the reason I do so is when I look around my neighbours, my community, and I look at people I know who have young children, all they talk about is coronavirus. They talk about the death toll. They talk about when restrictions are going to be lifted. And as we're beginning to see every day in our media, there are sweeping job losses. So just last week alone, we had 2,600 jobs announced as gone from OVO Energy, 9,000 from Rolls-Royce, and in both cases, the majority of those jobs potentially in Scotland. People are starting to look towards their own future. They've had a few weeks off. Sometimes the sun has shone. They've been worried about their health, yes, but they're moving on. And if we leave that space unoccupied and we don't try and populate it with ideas, then somebody else will claim that space. I think this is really our opportunity, yes, by all means, to say we support the government, we want them to defeat coronavirus, but by the way, you got the following things wrong, and that can never happen again. But we need to be the party that are in the territory of offering people hope for the future, that we have an economic recovery plan that is about preserving jobs, that we recognise the failings in our social care infrastructure, and we have a plan for that too. That's the thing that people's attention will turn to, and to get noticed, because in Scotland, we're in danger of becoming irrelevant. In Scotland, to get noticed, we have to be first out the traps, painting that vision of the future, capturing that ground, because otherwise we will not arrest the decline in Scotland.
Okay, if we could have Mary next then.
Thanks very much. I think firstly, again, in Wales, we're in government, so we're not in a position where we can't be talking about what's happening and what we're doing and what policy is. But I think I referred to this earlier. One of the things that does worry me is we're not in a position where we can do the policy preparation to the same level as we would normally be doing in advance of a devolved election. I mean, just in terms of infrastructure, we should have had our Welsh Policy Forum in November to make a first look at sort of policies for the manifesto. That was obviously postponed because of the general election. Welsh Labour Conference, which should have been at the end of March, had to be cancelled. There's a thought about trying to do that in the autumn, but who knows whether that will actually be possible. And we've got government ministers working all day, every day on actually dealing with this crisis. But I think one of the things that we as a party need to get better at is we do work at different levels. We have UK Labour Party, and we have a great shadow team now, I think, in Westminster. We have got the Scottish Party, the Welsh Party, and we have people running local government and people preparing manifestos for local government. We need to get better at exchanging ideas between all those different levels about what we can do and how we can put policy together at the different levels that is actually going to resonate with the electorate next May, assuming we have elections next May, but going forward as well. I think it's right that we don't commit too early, because the last thing you want is to give hostages to fortune, particularly large financial ones at a UK level. But actually doing that policy thinking gives us stuff that we can share across those boundaries, and I think enables us to put together a better, more coherent strategy if we get it right.
Okay, we get Tudor. Hopefully I've unmuted him properly.
There we are. Okay. Yeah, it's. I'm not. I think we shouldn't be unafraid of saying exactly what local government has done in this crisis, from bailing out the government's food distribution scheme, from making sure that the dreaded voucher scheme for free school meal children was sorted. We're now going to help to repair the track test methodology. Oh yes, PPE in care homes. Oh yes, staff in care homes. There are loads of stories of Labour local government riding to the rescue to bail out this Tory government. I don't think we should be ashamed of telling the truth of that. I don't think that's. I think the more people know that, the better it is. And so, you know, let's share that. Let's make it known. Let's not hide our light under a bushel about that, because let's be honest, if it hadn't been for local government, if it hadn't been for local councillors and council staff, we'd be in an even worse state than we are now. And we can talk about how involving local government at an earlier stage is a virtue, and it's a policy platform, because it gives you the chance. In my case, my authority, 700 services we provide in the community. That's a lot of manifesto commitments there. Take your pick. But the point is, it just goes to show there is plenty to advocate for. There is plenty of track record to boast about. There is plenty of credit to take and to share amongst whatever level. Whether we're talking about Jackie or whether we're talking about local government level, we need to be smarter at using the successes that we already have in front of us to paint a picture of competence as opposed to incompetence that the Tories are demonstrating. Nothing wrong with a bit of partisanship.
Chris, then, have you got anything to add? Hoping I've unmuted you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly. I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a tricky question on the topics we're talking about, because while the next election is 4 years away, there are really important elections next May as well, and we've already talked about the importance of winning seats in Scotland and Wales, and obviously that involves, to a certain extent, saying something. However, the general principle behind your comment that an opposition saying little at this point in Parliament is always, I think, fairly good politics, or committing to little at this stage in the Parliament. And I think it's particularly true now, not just because of the level of uncertainty thrown in because of the coronavirus pandemic and the impact that might have on the country. We don't know what impact that will be. We don't know what impact that will have on people's priorities, and therefore how the Labour Party needs to appeal to the public. But also because there's so much uncertainty at the moment about how the government is going to respond coming out of this crisis. There's going to be a massive economic hole that somehow needs to be filled. What is the government going to do in response to that is a big question, and we don't know the answer to it yet. Are they basically just going to borrow a load more money? Are they going to try and make a load of cuts? And depending on the decision they make there is also going to make a big impact on what Labour's critique of the government should be and what Labour's policy packages going into the next election. So until we have answers to those questions, it's very, very difficult to decide what story we should be telling right now. Labour should be telling right now.
Thank you all. So next we've got a question from Councillor Judy Billing, who I think I've just unmuted. Judy? Oh, no, is she there?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
There's nothing more dreadful than that you can do to me than mute me for a whole morning and a whole It's dire, it's dreadful. So I wanted to remind everybody who was doing this stuff about how absolutely ghastly the 2017 county council elections were, just before 5 weeks before the general election, which some people think we nearly won. At that time, the great influx of new members to the party wasn't even slightly interested in council elections, and we had the loneliest time possible. I've also never met a community organiser, and desperately hope that joining up all these elections, as we've been forced to do, will mean that there'll be a great body of people out there, not just the usual councillors, campaigning at the time. And the last thing I wanted to say, this isn't a question at all, it's a speech, isn't it?
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to say was, please, God, can we have a brilliant General Secretary as well, because that would make the party brilliant and my happiness complete. And I know it's not all about me, but I'm sure you all agree with me. Thank you. Do you all agree? That's the question.
As well as Judy's question, we'll call it that. I've got one more from the chat from Paul Mortimer, who asks, how can we ensure the party is on a solid financial footing to effectively fight campaigns, considering the impact of the cancellation of conference and potentially huge legal fines and payouts coming from the leaked report? So if we could have Tudor to answer those first, if possible.
Well, I mean, I for one, I my last call to Labour LGA this week demanded that we don't have another Jazz Fest. I think spending money on self-indulgent festivals featuring a range of rather marginal speakers is probably not the best way of, it's the best way to torture the members' cash, I guess. Yeah, I think what we've got to do is we've got to tighten up on what we're spending our money on. I think that's absolutely number one. I think there's a prospect now of getting a bit more money in from people who've abandoned us because they didn't want to be associated with us, but were great funders of ours for a number of years. And I think with Cllr's becoming a leader, I think we've got a reasonable chance of getting those taps turned back on. But I really think something has to be, we have to have somebody who knows how to fundraise in a party. I think we've got to get somebody in head office who knows what they're doing, who can speak to people nicely, and to get the income side going properly. And other than that, I think staff reform, as I said, community organisers, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds wasted when what we need is regional and local organisers and more trainees. They're fantastic. Those trainee organisers do a wonderful job across the country, and we need more of them.
Okay, if we go to Jackie next then.
Yep, let me start with money, because my mother always told me follow the money and you won't go wrong. In Scotland, at the last Scottish Parliament elections, just by way of contrast, the SNP spent 1.5 million, the Tories spent 1 million, and Labour spent £300,000. So the scale of what we need to do is quite enormous. What I'm exploring at the moment in Scotland is not trade unions chipping in money 5 weeks before polling day, but actually seconding officers across to help with the capacity of the organisation now, as well as, of course, contributing money. And please don't underestimate the fact that there is a new leader in town at a UK level means that some of the people that used to donate to us are willing to come back and donate to us. So we need to start having those key conversations very quickly in order to capitalise on that goodwill. Secondly, in terms of the party, I suspect Judy is too formidable to disagree with, so I'm going to heartily agree with her. I think we need a professional organisation, you know, and I've said for a long time, if a party officer is competent, I care far more about that than about their politics. We need people who can actually do the job and understand what the job is. And I have the most marginal constituency seat in Scotland. There's not been one community organiser that's ever set foot in it. And that tells me, I think, all we need to know. So I'll stop there.
Just a quick warning to everyone. We're due to finish at 10 past, so we may suddenly, mid-speech, be brutally yanked back to the main room. So could we have Chris next then, please?
Yeah, I mean, not much to add to that, apart from on the finances. It is obviously worth remembering that the Labour Party does still have 570,000 members, an incredible level of membership for any political party in the Western world. So, it is worth, there are a lot of members who can still be tapped up and are still paying a lot in fees. And, what we often tell you as pollsters is always, it's Labour's lost a lot of working class voters and they've gained a lot of richer middle class voters over the past few years. And I think that makes a lot of people inside the Labour Party rightly feel very uncomfortable. But the flip side of that is that there's now probably, 1997 levels of support for the Labour Party amongst millionaires, despite the fact that the party's doing worse amongst lots of other voter groups. So that does mean that there is a wider pool of money that could potentially be donated to the party.
Mary?
Firstly, agree with what everyone else has said. We need a general secretary who can run a professional organisation and people working within that organisation who can fundraise. I think one of the things we've benefited from in Wales is that we have managed to keep a really good, experienced staff team in Welsh Labour. And I think perhaps that's why, although we didn't do well, we didn't do quite as devastatingly as some other areas in December, because we did still have that professional Labour organisation, and we'll obviously need to build on that next year. Agree with what everyone said about, if we stop, we've got members, we can fundraise, there are people who will come back. We need to stop wasting money on things like Jazz Fest, although I did hear someone suggest we hold it in Cllr's Donkey Field.
Still there, Mary?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Otherwise, that would be a great note to end on. So I think good question to use up the remaining 2 minutes before we're all finally removed and decanted back into the main room. From Callum O'Dwyer, put simply, what is Labour's biggest strength across your areas? So, Mary.
That we are in government, that we can do things, that we can show Labour values in government. Things like the fact that we're giving £500 to every frontline social care worker in Wales, I think really demonstrates what our values
are. If we go with Jackie next then, please.
Very simply, I think it's our members, because if you've got members, you've got an opportunity to rebuild the party, starting very much at a community level.
Tudor, hoping I've unmuted you.
I think so. Sensible, practical, local.
Straight to the point. We might actually have time for one more question at this rate. Chris, anything to add?
I think in the polling at the moment, the best thing that Labour has going for it is Keir Starmer. His first impression amongst the public has been very positive, and even a quarter of Conservative voters say they have a favourable view of him, which is fairly good going by modern Labour Party leaders' standards.
Excellent. Has anyone got any more questions? Just looking for the chat. Cameron Bevan King asks, what does Labour need to do to win over 2019 Tory voters, specifically for the West Midlands Metro mayoral election? So I think if we could start with Chris as the polling expert.
So as I sort of mentioned at the start, I think the big thing that Labour can do is competency. I think trying to reclaim that from the Conservatives is something that is achievable. And this is something that a lot of Conservative voters care about, because it's the kind of thing that has driven them to vote Conservative for the past 2 decades. Even people that were still voting Conservative in the 90s were doing so because they saw them as the grown-up political party that normally is best at running things. And I think because of the Conservative Party that Labour's currently up against, and because of Cllr's sort of perceived strengths and weaknesses, it can kind of reclaim that mantle. So I think that's the main challenge for the party.
I suppose Mary is the geographically closest to the West Midlands.
Well, I can see Tudor had his hand up actually, so if he wants to go first.
That's a good idea.
Okay. Am I?
Yep, we've got you.
Okay, so you got a brilliant council in Wolverhampton. You got a brilliant council in Birmingham, getting better all the time. So that thing about local competence, yeah, you know these people, you know they are good, you know which services that they're doing well, you value them, they're down the end of your street. I mean, you know, I think it's important, and I hear what you're saying about Cllr as well, but you have got some local heroes as well that you can fall back on, and building it from that level rather than from a strategic level of government, which forgive me, the metro mayors are. Nobody cares about those. In most streets, in most towns, they don't care about them, but they care about Labour doing well and in local government. So I think you've got a lot of good assets there in the West Midlands, which we could be using more positively.
Mary, anything else to add?
I suppose the only thing I'll add is, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how it's going to play out having sort of 2 years elections in one, and we haven't mentioned at all that we've got Police and Crime Commissioner elections in England and Wales as well. And in a way, I suppose that's going to make it harder for all the resources to go into sort of half the areas. We're going to have to do it all in one go. So I think, you know, the fundraising and putting resources and targeting ruthlessly, frankly, is going to have to be the most important thing that we do. In terms of what we can do on the ground, it's about, I think Tudor's right, it's about promoting what you can do and achieve locally. But what we've also got to bear in mind is how we get that message across to people as well. You know, are we going to be able to knock on doors? Are we going to be able to deliver leaflets? And I think there's so much that's unknown at this stage. We need some kind of different levels of contingency planning about how all that's going to work and how we use online better.
Jackie, anything to add?
No, I think all politics is local. I don't pretend to understand what's going on in the West Midlands, but the observation I would make echoes Tudor's in the sense that the reason I win in my constituency is I build coalitions of different voters who aren't necessarily all instinctively Labour voters, but think that we have good local representation. If the West Midlands was in Scotland, I would of course say have a clear position on independence, stop the flip-flopping, say no to a second independence referendum and no to independence. There you go.
So apparently we're finishing in a minute or so. I'll just go through you one more time so that we're not just all blankly staring at my Zoom background. Jackie, any closing remarks?
I think, you know, there is a huge challenge in Scotland, and I don't underestimate that, but there is a real opportunity for us. And I think we do need to describe in Scotland what kind of vision we want of the future, because our election is next year. We don't have the luxury of waiting 4 years to do it.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, just say that the challenge in Scotland, Wales, all of the local elections next year, it will be an indication of just how big the challenge is that Labour has to face. And the polling at the moment shows Labour isn't in a good place across all of those areas. And it also shows that the Labour Party does have a real brand problem that it needs to try to fix. However, there are also reasons to be optimistic. The fact that the Tories don't have great numbers either. The fact that the first impression Keir Starmer's made with the public is quite good. And also the fact that the electorate is more volatile than it ever has been before. So big challenge ahead, but also reasons to think that it's possible.
Okay, Tudor,
Yep.
There we go.
I'm feeling more and more confident every day with Cllr because he's not a drag on us like the previous fellow was. And it's made a hell of a difference already, I think, in people's attitude to us.
Thank you. And then Mary.
So I hope all the voters whose doors I knocked on in December and November who said, come back when you've got another leader, will actually look again and start voting for us next year. And I think, you know, obviously in Wales we've got to have a clear progressive agenda, not just about what we're doing now, but about what we do over the next Parliament term. I think that's going to be incredibly important, because we know we've got another 4 years of Boris Johnson, or whoever the Tories, with the Tories in government in Westminster at the moment, 3 years next year, and we've got to be very clear that people in Wales need a Welsh Labour government to at least provide them with some protection against that, and that's what we've got to get across to people.
Okay, so that's it. That's us done. I've sent Joe Holland the message, so we should be going back to the big room soon. Thank you all for choosing this breakout session, and yeah, see you back at our next plenary shortly.